Now, Islamist extremism is not being effectively tackled by the government. That's according to the independent reviewer of Prevent, the government's anti-terror programme. He warns the public faces an increased threat of Islamist extremism and terrorism because the government is simply not doing enough to tackle them.
Yes, there were also warnings. The failure to take tougher action was fuelling a dangerous rise in anti-Semitism, and this inaction stemmed from a continuing bias within Prevent towards tackling the rise in right-wing terrorism rather than the main threat of Islamist terrorism. So we're asking, is Britain a breeding ground for extremism?
Well, GBNews presenter Patrick Christys thinks so, while the author and broadcaster Rebecca Reid says that Britain is not breeding extremism. Well, Patrick, let's start with you. Are we?
Well, we obviously are, and if Rebecca wants to call Stevie Wonder, even he would say that he can see it. It's absolutely common sense that we are breeding extremism, and you don't have to look very far to see it, do you? Why do we have bollards everywhere in busy areas? Oh, is that because the Mormons might be driving badly? Why are we looking over our shoulders at Christmas markets, as our Home Secretary wants us to do? Could that be some pesky Jehovah's Witnesses? No, obviously not. It is actually because we've got rabid Islamist extremism on the march in this country, emboldened by incredibly weak leadership and people who like to slander other people, who call it out by saying that they are just far right themselves. That is absolutely staggering. And I would just ask, how many people have to die? How many more Manchester Arena bombings do we have to have? How many borough markets do we have to have before people start calling it out for what it is? MPs last night bottled a vote because they were scared of rabid Islamist extremism. But it's us, it's the plebs who have to deal with it on the streets.
Rebecca?
I'm still not totally convinced that they bottled the vote because they were worried about extremism. I think they were worried about losing their seats. I think it's about trying to balance the wants of constituents versus the party's general desire for a specific vote. I'm not trying to suggest there isn't a problem with terrorism. There is a problem with terrorism. I just think that the problem with terrorism has kind of been consistent in this country throughout the last probably 40 years from different factions and different groups. And I think there is a perception that the focus on right-wing terrorism, particularly the radicalisation of young men, and Prevent has recently had a very big focus on the kind of Andrew Tates of the world, the sort of more angry men, the violence towards women aspect of terrorism. Just because those things are being discussed more doesn't mean that they're the only ones that are prioritised or cared about. Necessarily, a lot of the kind of policing and watch lists around terrorism have to be private. They can't publicise everything they do all the time. Otherwise,
But Patrick, Sir William Shawcross, who's done this review into Prevent, has claimed that there is a priority given to far-right extremism rather than the Islamist.
Absolutely. Of course there is. Our MPs and various different people in society will trip over themselves to blame everything other than radical Islam. We had an MP who was obviously stabbed to death by a radical Islamist, and I'm, in this sense as well, keen to not discount what happened to Joe Cox. Of course, that was awful, but it does not undermine the fact that the major threat is Islamist terrorism. What happened when David Amess died? Oh, we had a debate on social media. What happened when Mike Freer said he was quitting? Oh, MPs need to talk more nicely to each other. Why can't they actually get to grips with the real problem? I mean, also, it runs deeper than this. The Home Office, after we had Abdul Azidi, who is now believed to have died, was a twice failed asylum seeker, OK? The Home Office decided, this is according to Stephen Edgington in the Telegraph, to not send any internal memos about that particular bloke round. Instead, they were very, very careful to make sure that they mentioned to staff that it was World Hijab Day, and we can't be offending people to do with that. We have our priorities all wrong in this country. If you ask people what they are more scared of, the police, politicians, members of the public, they are scared of offending a mob or being attacked by a mob of radical Islamists than they are about anyone else in this country.
Well, let's throw that right back to you, Rebecca. We're too scared of standing up to the extremism within our society.
I don't think so. I don't know anybody who's encountered any resistance to saying I dislike terrorism or I find extreme Islam unpalatable, dangerous.
Yesterday, someone told me Hamas wasn't a terror group outside Parliament. So there's that
person, yesterday, somebody also said that Israel had planned the 7th of October bombings, attacks, so that they could bomb Gaza. There are people who say stupid, untrue things. That has always been the case. We hear much more content than we ever did. We talk about everything more than we ever did. There is 24-hour news constantly. We feed this cycle by talking about it. I think there is a perception this problem is worse than it ever has been, and I'm just not sure that's true. I don't think it is. I think we just talk about it all the time now.
We currently have a group of people who are not even from this particular school, the Michaela Academy, who are taking that school to the High Court because they didn't want to put a prayer room in that school. That is extremism. We've had people outside Batley Grammar School, terrorising a teacher who's had to go into hiding, as a result of it. And we've had an autistic lad who's scuffed a copy of the Quran. His mum gets marched down to the local mosque with 2 police officers in tow to apologise to members of the local community there. And you tell me that's not extremism?
Specifically to your last case, absolutely, that was a failure of policing, and we all know I have major issues with the police. Specific to the Michaela Academy point, that's not really exactly what happened. It is a pupil at the school who led this, and specifically, they are not saying they had to have a prayer room in the school. They're saying people have to be able to pray at lunchtime in a classroom, and that is within the realm of what you would expect to be able to do under a religious freedom in any given sensible, safe country. So I think it's very easy to rack up all of these, especially if we take the absolute juiciest bit of the headline and then not look at the total body of the article and make it sound like there is a worse problem than there actually is. There have always been bad people at the extremes of all religions and all groups, and those people still exist now as they ever did, but that does not mean that the problem is worse than it's ever been.
Ask Jews about that.
Absolutely. Islamophobia and anti-Semitic attacks and abuses have been on the rise completely.
Specifically, massively anti-Semitism, yeah.
Just as when COVID started, there was an enormous spike in anti-Asian hate crime. There is a real issue with when any group is overrepresented in the media, they become targets. We have a fundamentally racist and intolerant society.
We have a fundamentally racist and intolerant society, do we? I find that absolutely staggering, given that we are not seeing protests on the streets about record levels of net migration year on year. We're not seeing massive demonstrations on the streets about people coming across the channel, despite the fact that in this very report that we are talking about today, it name-checks what's happening in terms of illegal immigration and tells us specifically that we are importing terrorists. I spoke to Robert Jemrig, who is also former immigration minister, of course, who's seen behind the curtain, who could not be clearer that we are importing people who wish to, at times, blow us up in this country. We are not seeing massive marches on the streets about this. We are not an intolerant society. If I would argue, we're importing people who are incredibly intolerant, actually.
I think we are an intolerant society in the sense that there is an enormous issue with anti-Semitism in this country. There is an enormous issue with Islamophobia. We have record levels of hate crimes. That does not suggest that everybody here is a racist. And I am, again, not suggesting for a second that the Tory government have done a great job with immigration for the last 12 years. They've done a really, really appalling job. No one is suggesting that things are doing well, but I still fundamentally think that if you are only looking at the Islamic part of the terrorism issue, you are only looking at one piece of the puzzle. It is wider than that. And fundamentally, this is about the fact that you can only radicalise people who are vulnerable and unhappy. And if you look at that part, you can actually undo it. You can't radicalise a happy, well-balanced person.
Excuse me, yes, you can, because you put pressure on them. What's happening right now in our politics is that people are going door to door and campaigning, and they are asking those people on the doorstep, how are you going to respond on Judgment Day? There are clips of this. That is intolerable community pressure. That is intolerable community pressure being put on people, and it is very easy to radicalise people under those circumstances.
Right,
I wish more people in this country...
Let's leave it there. Fantastic debate. Great to hear both of your views on that. Rebecca Reid, author and broadcaster, and, of course, Patrick Christy, GB News presenter.